The air at the Hemmings Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a humid August soup tasting of diesel exhaust, stale coffee, and the quiet desperation of a family selling off a lifetime. It was 1973, and corn was king. Prices were sky high, and you could feel a manic energy buzzing through the crowd of farmers, a gold rush fever that made men either bold or foolish. I was there, leaning against the rusty fender of my Ford pickup, mostly to pay my respects to old man Hemmings. He was a good man, but his heart had given out mid-row on his John Deere 730, and his kids wanted nothing to do with the land but the cash it would bring. I watched the auctioneer, a fast-talking showman named Bill, work his magic on the crowd, selling off hay rakes and grain augers for prices that would have been laughable 2 years prior. My own operation was small, just the 320 acres my father had left me, every square inch of it paid for. My main iron was Dad's 1951 Farmall M, its 4-cylinder engine as familiar to me as my own heartbeat, and a 1962 John Deere 4010 I'd bought with 3 years of saved-up crop money. They were old, they were simple, and they were mine. No banker held a note on them. That's why the sight of Richard Peterson made the back of my neck prickle. Rich was my age, but he moved through the world like he owned it already and was just waiting for the paperwork to clear. He'd inherited the farm next to mine, and while I'd spent the 60s learning how to weld a cracked block and rebuild a carburetor, he'd spent it learning about leverage and depreciation schedules at the state university. He stood near the auctioneer's truck, a cocky grin on his face, his checkbook practically vibrating in his shirt pocket. He'd already bought a nearly new 6-bottom plough and a disc I knew for a fact Hemmings had paid too much for just last spring, but Rich wasn't done. The main event was the last parcel of land, 80 acres of prime bottom ground that bordered my south fence row. Bill the auctioneer started the bidding high, and it climbed faster than a squirrel up a cornstalk. I watched, a silent observer, as neighbor after neighbor dropped out, shaking their heads. It came down to 2 men, a quiet farmer from the next county over, and Rich Peterson. The price soared past what anyone thought was sane. Finally, the other farmer sighed, wiped his brow with a handkerchief, and gave a slight shake of his head. "Sold," Bill shouted, his gavel cracking like a rifle shot, "to Mr. Richard Peterson." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Rich had just paid more per acre for that land than anyone in the county had ever dreamed of. He accepted the handshakes and backpats like a conquering hero. As the crowd began to break up, he made a point of walking over to me. "Jedediah," he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, "shame you didn't get in on that. A man could make a killing with land like that." "It's good land, Rich. Hemmings always took care of it," I said, keeping my voice even. He smirked, looking past me toward my old pickup, then gesturing vaguely toward my farm down the road. "Yeah, well, you need the right equipment to make it pay. That old Farmall of yours would probably have a heart attack just looking at an 80-acre field. You ought to think about upgrading, Jed. The bank in town is practically giving money away. Get yourself a new 1066, maybe one of those new 4-wheel drive Steigers. Otherwise," he leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping to a confidential poison, "we'll all be back here in a few years for your auction." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was anything but friendly, and walked away, leaving his words hanging in the thick air. I felt the heat rise in my face, the familiar burn of pride and anger. The men who'd overheard him shuffled their feet and looked away, not wanting to get involved. I just stood there, my hands clenched into fists in my pockets, and watched him go. The world was changing. The old ways of thrift and patience my father had taught me were being called foolishness. Get big or get out, that was the new gospel. And Rich Peterson was its loudest preacher. On the drive home, his words echoed in my head. I took the old gravel back road, the one that wound past the abandoned McGregor place, just to cool off. The McGregor farm had been empty for 10 years, ever since the old man died and his wife moved to an apartment in Des Moines. The house was sagging, the roof of the main barn had collapsed into a skeletal V, and the outbuildings were slowly being swallowed by a jungle of sumac and wild grapevines. As I rounded the sharp bend by the collapsed barn, something caught my eye. It was a flash of green, a peculiar industrial shade of lime green, almost hidden by the shoulder-high weeds. It was massive. I slowed my truck to a crawl, then pulled over, the gravel crunching under my tires. I got out, the air still and silent except for the buzz of cicadas. I pushed through the prickly brush, the weeds scratching at my jeans, until I was standing before it. It was a tractor, or what was left of one. It was an articulated four-wheel drive, a monster, bigger than anything I'd ever seen up close. The paint was faded and peeling, revealing patches of angry orange rust underneath. Two of the enormous tires were flat, the rubber cracked and split open to the cords. The cab glass was shattered, and a thick vine had snaked its way through the broken windshield and was wrapping itself around the steering wheel. It looked like the fossilized remains of some prehistoric beast that had laid down to die in this field a decade ago. On the side of the hood, I could just make out the faded, peeling decal, Steiger. A Bearcat too, I figured from the shape of the cab. It was a giant, broken and forgotten. Most men, Rich Peterson included, would have seen nothing but a 10-ton heap of scrap iron. A worthless pile of junk. But as I stood there, smelling the damp earth and decay, I saw something else. I saw potential. I saw power. I saw a way to fight back, not on the bank's terms, but on my own. Now, before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever come across a piece of old iron, a forgotten tractor or a truck sitting in a field, and just felt that pull, that need to save it? Let me know down in the comments what you found and what you did with it. Because what I saw wasn't just scrap metal, it was a challenge. And Lord knows, I've never been one to back down from a challenge. It took me a week to track down Mrs. McGregor. She was a sweet, frail woman living in a small, tidy apartment that smelled of lavender and old memories. When I asked her about the old green tractor behind her barn, her eyes clouded over. "Oh, that thing," she sighed. "My Walter bought that right before he got sick. Traded in our two best tractors for it. He said it was the future. He only got to use it for one season." She told me it had thrown a rod right through the side of the engine block the following spring. Walter had planned to fix it, but then the cancer came and the tractor just sat. After he passed, she'd had no use for it and no way to move it. "I suppose it's just junk now," she said sadly. "Mom," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I'm not a rich man, but I'll give you $500 cash for it. As is, where is. I'll haul it away myself." Her eyes widened. $500 was a lot of money for a pile of scrap in 1973. To me, it was nearly all the cash I had on hand. It was a gamble, a massive one. She agreed immediately, and I left with a handwritten bill of sale on a piece of notebook paper. The next Saturday, I set out to claim my prize. Getting it home was a battle of biblical proportions. I brought my John Deere 4010, a collection of logging chains, 2 hydraulic jacks, and every heavy-duty tool I owned. The Steiger sat dead and silent, weighing close to 20,000 pounds. The first problem was the tires. The two on the left side were completely flat, the rims sunk into the soft earth. It took me 2 hours with a sledgehammer, pry bars, and a dictionary's worth of curse words just to break the beads. I couldn't fix them there, so I had to drag it as it was. I hooked the heaviest chain I had from the drawbar of my 4010 to the front of the Steiger. I put the John Deere in its lowest gear, eased out the clutch, and tightened the chain. The 4010's diesel engine, a solid 80-horsepower 6-cylinder, deepened its growl, the exhaust stack puffing out a cloud of black smoke. The rear tires dug into the dirt, but the green monster didn't budge. It was anchored to the earth. I spent the rest of the morning digging. I dug out the sunken rims, jacked them up one by one, and shoved old planks under them. By noon, I was covered in sweat, grease, and mud. I tried again. This time, with a groaning shriek of tortured metal, the Steiger moved. It lurched forward a few inches, its flat tires dragging and tearing through the soil. The 5-mile journey home was a slow, agonizing crawl. I couldn't go more than a mile an hour. The 4010 was straining at the very edge of its limits. The engine temperature gauge crept steadily into the red, and the smell of hot oil and overworked metal filled the air. Every time I hit a slight incline, the Deere's wheels would spin, and I'd have to back up and try to get a running start. It was on the main gravel road, about halfway home, that Rich Peterson drove past. He was in his shiny new Chevrolet pickup. He slowed down, rolled down his window, and just stared. Then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming laugh that echoed across the cornfields. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The sight of me, wrestling this giant derelict piece of junk down the road with my antique tractor, was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. He shook his head, still chuckling, and sped off, leaving me in a cloud of dust and humiliation. By the time I finally dragged the Steiger into my farmyard, dusk was settling. My muscles ached, my hands were raw, and my 4010 was clicking and pinging as it cooled down, exhausted. I had done it. But as I looked at the colossal broken machine sitting in my yard, a monument to my stubbornness, the coffee shop talk started. They called it Jed's Folly. The story of me dragging it home, with Rich Peterson's laughter as the punchline, became the talk of the county. I was no longer just the quiet farmer who kept to himself. I was the fool who'd spent good money on a 10-ton paperweight. That winter, my machine shed became my sanctuary. With the cold wind howling outside, I began the real work. I drained what was left of the fluids. Out of the transmission came a gallon of rusty, milky water before any gear oil appeared. That was a bad sign. I started the teardown. Every bolt was rusted solid, every connection a battle. I used a torch, penetrating oil, and a 4-foot breaker bar to get things moving. The engine was the heart of the problem. It was a Caterpillar 3208, a big, naturally aspirated V8 diesel. Just as Mrs. McGregor had said, there was a fist-sized hole in the side of the block where a connecting rod had made a violent exit. Worse, when I pulled the heads, I found the block was cracked in 2 other places between the cylinders. It had frozen solid with plain water in it. The engine was pure scrap. I spent weeks disassembling that Cat V8, piece by piece, laying out the parts on my workshop floor. The crankshaft was scored, the pistons were shot, the camshaft was garbage. It was a complete loss. The transmission was just as bad. I pulled it apart to find gears chewed up and bearings pitted with rust from the water that had sat in it for years. The massive articulation joint that allowed the tractor to pivot in the middle had so much play in it, you could move it an inch back and forth by hand. Night after night, I worked under the cold, bare light bulb in my shed, surrounded by the smell of solvent and old grease. I labeled every part, cleaned every bolt, and filled notebooks with diagrams and lists. To anyone else, it was a hopeless, overwhelming mess. A fool's errand. But to me, it was a puzzle, a complex, greasy, 1,000-piece puzzle. And as the snow piled up outside, I slowly, methodically began to put it back together. The years from 1974 to 1978 were the golden years for farmers who were willing to gamble. The Russian grain deal had opened up new markets, and demand was insatiable. Corn prices stayed strong, and land values shot through the roof. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling us to plant fence row to fence row, to get big, to borrow money and expand. It was a heady time, a time of seemingly endless prosperity. Richard Peterson became the living embodiment of that philosophy. He was the golden boy of the First National Bank of Grafton. He used his new 80 acres as collateral to buy another quarter section. Then he used that to buy another. He built a new state-of-the-art grain handling system with towering silos that dwarfed my simple corn crib. He traded his year-old International 1066 for a brand new 1466 with a Deluxe cab, air conditioning, and a radio. Then, in 1976, he bought his own Steiger, a brand new Panther III, a roaring 325-horsepower beast that made my Folly look like a garden tractor. He paraded it around the county, showing it off, the chrome exhaust stack gleaming in the sun. His operation was a marvel of modern efficiency. He had 2 full-time hired hands. His wife drove a new Lincoln Continental. They added a big extension onto their house with a swimming pool in the back. On paper, Rich Peterson was a millionaire several times over. He was featured in the State Farming magazine, a handsome, smiling young farmer standing in front of his fleet of new, red machinery, talking about growth and the future. Meanwhile, I just kept farming my 320 acres. I was making good money, better money than my father ever had. My yields were solid, and my costs were low. But I didn't expand. I didn't buy new equipment. I patched the tires on my old Ford pickup and kept driving it. My neighbors, even the ones who used to respect my father's ways, started to look at me with a kind of pity. They saw my discipline as a lack of vision. "Jed could be doing what Rich is doing," I'd hear them say down at the diner. "He's just scared, too stuck in his old man's ways to see the opportunity right in front of him." They didn't see where my money was going. Every spare dollar, every penny not needed for seed, fuel, or property taxes was funneled into the green monster in my shed. It was a slow, painstaking process. I found a used 3.8 engine block at a salvage yard in Kansas that had come out of a wrecked semi-truck. It cost me nearly $1,000 and another $200 to get it shipped. I spent an entire winter carefully measuring every tolerance, checking every surface, and slowly rebuilding it with a mix of new and salvaged parts. I bought the official Caterpillar service manuals and studied them every night until the pages were stained with grease and coffee. I taught myself how to rebuild the transmission, replacing every bearing and seal, machining a new shaft on my old metal lathe. I ordered new heavy-duty bearings for the articulation joint and spent a week with a torch and a press, getting the old worn-out races out and the new ones in. I was building a tractor from the ground up, and I was doing it my way, with my own two hands and my own cash. By the summer of 1978, 5 years after I'd dragged it home, Jed's Folly was starting to look like a tractor again. The rebuilt Cat engine was sitting in the freshly painted frame, plumbed and ready. I'd rewired the entire machine from scratch using heavy-gauge wire and weatherproof connectors, creating a system far more reliable than the original. The cab was still rough, the seat torn and the glass missing, but the mechanical heart was sound. It was my secret weapon, my insurance policy against a world that seemed to have gone mad with debt. I was finishing up the fuel lines one evening in the fall of 1979 when Rich drove into my yard. He was in his new pickup, and he stopped and got out, walking over to the open door of my machine shed. He looked at the Steiger, which was now sitting on 4 brand-new, deep-lug tires I'd finally saved up enough to buy. "Well, I'll be," he said, a hint of grudging admiration in his voice. "You actually got the old girl put back together. Does it run?" "It will," I said, not looking up from the fitting I was tightening. He chuckled. "You know, Jed, I've got to hand it to you. You're stubborn. But you've wasted, what, 6 years on this thing? I just bought another 160 acres today, right on the highway. Prime development land in a few years." He shook his head, a pitying smile on his face. "You're playing checkers, while the rest of us are playing chess." He'd come over just to tell me that, to rub his success in my face one more time. As he was leaving, the local banker, Mr. Harrison, pulled into his driveway across the road. Harrison got out of his car and waved at Rich. "Just dropping off the paperwork, Rich," he called out. "The board approved it this morning. The sky's the limit for you, son." Rich gave me a final triumphant smirk and walked across the road to meet the banker. I watched them shake hands, 2 men convinced they had the world by the tail. But that night, listening to the news on the radio, I heard a different story. The announcer was talking about something happening in Iran, about oil prices, about runaway inflation. And he mentioned a number I'd never paid much attention to before, the prime interest rate. It had just jumped to over 15%. A cold feeling, a deep unease, settled in my gut. It felt like the stillness in the air right before a tornado, when the birds stop singing and the sky turns a sickly green. Rich Peterson and the bankers were looking at the sky and seeing nothing but sunshine and opportunity. But I could feel a change in the wind, a storm front moving in that had nothing to do with the weather. And I just tightened the last bolt on my fuel line, knowing my folly might soon be the only thing that could save me. That winter of '79 bled into the spring of 1980 with a strange tension in the air. The talk on the radio was all about interest rates and embargoes. But in the coffee shop, the talk was still about planting. Optimism is a farmer's most essential tool, and most of my neighbors were still convinced that prices would rebound, that the good times were just taking a breath. Rich Peterson was their chief evangelist. He'd refinanced his operating loan at the new, higher rate, telling everyone it was a short-term problem. "You've got to spend money to make money," he'd say, buying another new planter, a 12-row Deere Max Emerge that made my old 4-row International look like a toy. That spring, after 6 long years, I turned the key on the Steiger for the first time. I'd filled the crankcase with 15 gallons of fresh Rotella oil and primed the fuel system, bleeding the lines all the way to the injectors. I'd installed 2 massive truck batteries I'd bought from a salvage yard. I climbed into the cab, the ripped vinyl of the seat cold against my back. I took a deep breath, the smell of new paint and old diesel filling my lungs. I turned the key. The starter motor, a big Delco Remy 42MT, whined for a moment, then engaged with a solid thud. The rebuilt Caterpillar V8 turned over once, twice, hesitating as the cold oil circulated. On the third revolution, it coughed a thick cloud of black smoke from the simple straight pipe exhaust I'd welded myself. Then, with a deep guttural roar that shook the entire machine shed, it caught. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of the new turbocharged engines. It was a low, rumbling thunder, the sound of pure, raw displacement. I let it idle for a few minutes, my hand resting on the shifter, feeling the vibration travel up my arm. It was alive. A grin split my face, the first genuine, bone-deep smile I'd felt in years. Jed's Folly had a heartbeat. I put it to work that spring, pulling a 24-foot field cultivator I'd bought for scrap value and rebuilt. The big tractor didn't even notice the implement behind it. It just moved across the fields with an effortless authority, the 8 huge tires leaving a flat, wide track on the dark soil. People would stop their trucks on the road to watch. The laughter had stopped. Now they just stared, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief on their faces. Then the rain stopped. May was dry. June was drier. By July, the sky was a pale, unforgiving sheet of brass. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high, was stunted and yellow, the leaves curling in on themselves to conserve every drop of moisture. The ground cracked open in deep fissures, and a hot wind blew across the fields day after day, carrying away topsoil and hope. It was the beginning of the great drought of 1980. My crops suffered just like everyone else's. But my costs were fixed. My fuel came from a tank I'd filled the year before. When a hydraulic line on my 4010 burst, I drove to town, bought a new length of hose and the fittings, and fixed it myself in under an hour. My break-even point was low. Rich Peterson's was not. I saw him out in his fields constantly, his big air-conditioned Panther III running from dawn until well past dusk. He was trying to outwork the weather to force a crop from the parched earth. One afternoon, I saw him stopped in the middle of a field. I drove my pickup to the fence row. He was standing on the ground, staring at a massive puddle of hydraulic fluid spreading in the dust under his tractor. "What's the trouble?" I called out. He looked over, his face grim and smudged with grease. "Hydraulic pump went out," he snapped. "Thing's not even 4 years old. Dealer says they're a week out on getting a new one from the factory." A week? And it's going to cost $3,000. $3,000 was more than I'd paid for my entire John Deere tractor. He kicked one of the giant tires in frustration. "This thing, it's all computer boards and specialized parts. I can't even touch it myself without the right diagnostic tools." He looked over at my old green monster parked by my barn. "Bet you could fix anything on that junk heap with a crescent wrench and a hammer." He didn't say it as an insult this time. There was a weary, bitter edge of truth to it. The cracks were showing, and not just in the dry earth. The bank started calling him. The fuel supplier put him on a cash-only basis. He had to let one of his hired hands go. The grand chess game he'd been playing was falling apart because one of his prize pieces had broken, and he didn't have the cash on hand to fix it. He was land-rich and cash-poor, a prisoner of his own ambition. The drought broke in late August, but it was too late. The harvest was a disaster across the county. Yields were less than half of what was needed to cover the high-interest operating loans everyone had taken out. The first foreclosure notices started appearing in the county paper, small print obituaries for family farms that had been around for 100 years. The storm I had sensed was no longer on the horizon. It had arrived. The fall of 1981 was when the floor fell out. To combat the rampant inflation that had been crippling the country, the Federal Reserve, under a man named Paul Volcker, cranked interest rates to levels nobody had ever seen. The prime rate hit an unbelievable 21.5%. At the same time, the grain embargo lingered, and commodity prices stayed in the gutter. It was a brutal 1-2 punch. Land values, which had been inflated by years of speculative buying, collapsed. Suddenly, farmers who had borrowed against their land's high value were upside down, owing the bank far more than their farms were worth. The First National Bank of Grafton, which had so eagerly handed out money just a few years before, turned vicious. Mr. Harrison, the friendly banker who used to bring loan papers to Rich's front door, was replaced by a grim-faced man from Des Moines whose only job was to call in notes and liquidate assets. The era of easy credit was over. The era of reckoning had begun. Rich Peterson was trapped. His variable rate loans, tied to the prime rate, had become an anchor dragging him to the bottom. The monthly interest payments alone were more than what my father had made in an entire year. He tried to sell some of his newer equipment to raise cash, but the market was flooded. A brand new combine he'd paid over $100,000 for now wouldn't bring 50. No one had the money or the credit to buy. I watched it happen from across the road, a slow, heartbreaking implosion. First, the Lincoln Continental was sold. Then the swimming pool sat empty and green. They let the last hired hand go. Rich was out there by himself, trying to manage over 1,000 acres with equipment he couldn't afford to fuel, let alone repair. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. The stress was etched on his face, carving new lines around his eyes and mouth. My farm, by contrast, was an island of stability in a sea of chaos. I wasn't thriving, not by a long shot. Corn was barely $1 a bushel. But I owed nothing. My property taxes were my biggest expense. I did my own repairs. I burned wood from my own timber lot to heat my house. I used the big Steiger for the heavy tillage, its powerful, efficient engine getting the work done in half the time, saving precious fuel. I used the old, nimble Farmall M for planting and cultivating, sipping gasoline. I was surviving. In the spring of 1982, the auction trucks rolled into Rich Peterson's yard. It was a cold, grey day in March, with a wind that cut to the bone. The crowd was different from the one at the Hemmings sale nearly a decade earlier. There was no excitement, no feverish bidding. Just quiet, somber-faced farmers in worn work coats, watching a neighbour's life get sold off piece by piece. They were there not to gloat, but to bear witness, and maybe to wonder who would be next. I stood at the back, leaning against my truck, just as I had all those years ago. The auctioneer, a new man I didn't recognize, spoke in a flat, monotone voice, a stark contrast to the showman who had sold Rich the Hemmings land. The magnificent Panther III Steiger, the symbol of Rich's empire, sold for less than a quarter of what he'd paid for it. The big combines, the planters, the grain trucks, all went for pennies on the dollar to corporate farm operations from out of state. Rich stood near his house, his wife beside him, her arm linked through his. He didn't watch the bidding. He just stared off at the horizon, his face a mask of stone. He had gambled everything on the new way, on the gospel of get big or get out, and he had lost. As I watched his life's work being dismantled, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Just a profound, aching sadness for him, and for all the others like him. The system that had built him up had torn him down just as quickly, and I knew that but for a stubborn belief in my father's old ways, it could have been me. A month later, a notice was posted on the courthouse door. The bank was selling the 80 acres of prime bottom ground that had once belonged to Old Man Hemmings, the very land that had started Rich on his path to ruin. It was a sealed bid auction, no fanfare, just a quiet, desperate attempt by the bank to recoup some of its losses. I went home and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I pulled out the old metal box where I kept my savings. For nearly a decade, I had lived frugally, banking the profits from the good years, socking away cash instead of spending it on new paint and shiny iron. I counted it out. It was a substantial amount, more money than I'd ever had in one place in my life. The next morning, I drove to the bank in the next town over, the one that wasn't failing, and had them draw up a cashier's check. I drove to the courthouse and submitted my bid in a plain white envelope. I didn't know if it would be enough. I didn't know if some big out-of-state corporation would outbid me. I just knew I had to try. It felt like closing a circle that had been left open for 9 years. A week later, I got a call from the bank in Des Moines. My bid was the highest. The land was mine. I didn't celebrate. I just drove out and walked the fence row between my property and the new 80. The soil was rich and dark, just as I remembered. It was good land. It had been my father's dream to own it one day. Now it was mine, bought and paid for not with borrowed money, but with cash earned through patience and sweat. That evening, I saw a pickup truck parked on the road by Rich's now empty farmstead. I recognized it as his brother's. Rich was sitting on the tailgate, just looking at the house he had lost. The lights were off. The place looked abandoned, haunted. I hesitated for a moment, then got in my own truck and drove over. I pulled up beside him. He didn't look at me. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the ticking of my cooling engine. "I heard you bought the Hemmings place," he said finally, his voice raspy. "I did," I said. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "So you win, Jed. You were right all along. Your dad's way, the old way. You win." "This wasn't a contest, Rich," I said quietly. "There are no winners in this. We all lost something." I looked at him, at the slumped shoulders of a man who had lost everything. "Planting season's starting. I've got 80 more acres to work now. It's more than I can handle alone." I took a breath. "I could use a hand, a good man who knows that ground. I'll pay you a fair wage. Cash." He finally turned to look at me. His eyes were red-rimmed, and for the first time I saw not the arrogant rival, but just a beaten man. He stared at me, searching my face for any hint of pity or gloating. He found none. He seemed to shrink a little, the last of his pride giving way to a raw, desperate need. He swallowed hard and nodded, unable to speak. "Be at my place at sunrise," I said, and drove away, leaving him there in the twilight. Rich worked for me that spring and the next. He was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. He knew farming, and he was a hard worker. We rarely spoke of the past. We didn't need to. The understanding was there in the shared work, in the turning of the soil, in the long days under the sun. We worked side by side, me on my old John Deere 4010, him on the big green Steiger he had once laughed at. He treated that machine with a respect that bordered on reverence, understanding now that its power wasn't in its newness, but in the fact that it was owned completely and totally. The coffee shop talk changed. The story of Jed's folly was told now with a different ending. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was a parable. I wasn't the fool who bought a pile of junk. I was the man who saw the storm coming. They looked at my patched-up equipment and my debt-free land, not with pity, but with a deep, hard-won respect. The gospel of get big or get out had died a quiet death, replaced by a renewed belief in the virtues of thrift, of patience, of knowing your limits. Rich eventually saved up enough money to put a down payment on a small house in town. He took a job managing the local co-op. The day he left, he came over to the shed. He shook my hand, his grip firm. "Jedediah," he said, looking me straight in the eye, "thank you. You didn't have to do what you did." "You'd have done the same for me," I lied. But looking at the man he had become, I wasn't so sure it was a lie anymore. Years passed. The farm economy found its footing again, but it was a scarred, more cautious world. I never got big. I just farmed my 400 acres, kept my equipment running, and slept soundly at night. I watched my children grow up and have children of their own. One crisp autumn afternoon, when I was well into my 60s, my grandson, a boy of 10 with my father's eyes, was with me in the machine shed. I was showing him how to change the fuel filter on the old Steiger. Its green paint was faded and chipped, showing the primer in 100 places, but the Cat V8 still rumbled to life with the same authority it had decades before. "Grandpa," he asked, his small hands smudged with grease, "why didn't you ever buy a new tractor? One with a computer and a GPS like Mr. Henderson has?" I stopped turning the wrench and looked at the old green giant. I thought of the day I'd dragged it home, of Rich Peterson's laughter echoing in a cloud of dust. I thought of the long winter nights spent rebuilding it, bolt by bolt. I thought of the quiet satisfaction of owning something, truly owning it, in a world that encouraged everyone to rent their lives from the bank. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Because this one's ours," I said, my voice thick with the weight of memory. "It doesn't owe anyone a dime. See, it's not about having the newest or the biggest thing. It's about this." I gestured out the open shed door toward the fields of harvested corn stubble, golden in the late afternoon sun. It's about being here tomorrow and the day after that. This land, this iron, it's not a race, it's a legacy. And our job, I said, handing him the wrench, is to make sure it lasts. He looked from the tractor to the land and then back to me, a glimmer of understanding in his young eyes. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, the old green tractor stood silent, a monument not to folly, but to a different kind of wealth, the kind you can't count in a ledger, but you can feel deep in your bones, solid and enduring as the earth itself.